To begin this afternoon, we have a moderated discussion on nation states and criminal threats. And we are particularly honored to have CNN's Evan Perez to be our moderator. So, Evan, I will ask you and your gang to come on in. And turn it over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's a great day to be here and to have two of the Justice Department, two of the government's top experts on cybersecurity joining us for this discussion. Let me first introduce Leslie Caldwell, who's the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division at Justice Department. She oversees about 600 attorneys who prosecute federal criminal cases around the country. And she and her division work with U.S. attorneys around the country in bringing criminal cases. One of them that she brought, that her department, her division, and U.S. Attorney's Office brought was against cyber criminals behind the Game Over Zeus botnet. This was last year. This was a botnet that infected up to 1 million computers used to steal millions of dollars from businesses and customers. And we'll talk about that case some more as part of our discussion. And this is John Carlin. He's the Assistant Attorney General for National Security. Leads about 350 lawyers and other employees who are responsible for federal prosecutions investigations involving terrorism, espionage, cybersecurity breaches, and so on. He works with prosecutors also around the country on these cases. One of them was very notable last year, bringing charges against 5 members of the Chinese People Liberation Army, who allegedly were behind cyber attacks against major U.S. manufacturing companies. So thank you both for joining us. And Leslie, I'll start with you. Give me a sense of your priorities. What are the issues you see cropping up that come across your desk?
So I think cybercrime is really one of the highest priorities of the criminal division. The new Attorney General was sworn in this morning, finally, and said that cybercrime is going to be one of her priorities in her tenure as Attorney General. So we're on the criminal side, we're very focused on working cooperatively internationally, because cybercrime is very international, and I would say every single case that I've seen in the year that I've been in this job has involved multiple countries. So it's really important for us to develop and work on better relationships and increasing our already good relationships with foreign law enforcement. We also have to make sure that our prosecution tools keep pace with technology and changes in technology. So we have to make sure that the legislation that's out there is capable of addressing the problems that change every day. We also really need to make sure that we have the right amount of resources, which is something that right now we're growing our resources, but not nearly fast enough to keep up with the problem. And so I think those are really the priorities right now on the criminal side.
You guys set up the cybersecurity unit as part of the computer crime and intellectual property section. Tell me what that does real quick, and how does it fit into this larger picture?
So one thing we've realized is that we have been pretty effective at addressing cyber crimes that already have occurred, but we weren't so effective at trying to prevent cybercrime. And I think that's something we really need to get better at. And so in December, we created the cybersecurity unit, which the focus of that is going to be on prevention. It's going to be on education of the public, education of companies, helping companies make sure that they have response plans in place for when they're breached, that they have those in advance of a breach instead of just reacting. We're doing a lot of education and outreach. In fact, this week we're hosting a cybersecurity summit, which will be attended by a lot of members of private industry. And I think it's incredibly important that we try our best to get ahead of this problem in a way that we've done with other kinds of criminal problems, but we're just now starting to do with cyber.
Okay. John, you have overseen some of the cases that have caused, international headlines, particularly the PLA case. Tell me a little bit about the problems that you see coming forward, that you're tackling in NSD.
Sure. So the National Security Division was the first new litigating division started at the Department of Justice in about 50 years, and we were started up in 2006. And we were created as one of the responses to the devastating attacks of September 11th. And the idea was simple, that there should be a one-stop shop at the Department of Justice where prosecutors and intelligence lawyers sat side by side and looked at the threat, which was those posed by terrorist groups and nation states, and then looked at the full range of legal tools available to the United States government to stop those threats, prevent the attack. A win is not a criminal case, it's not any type of resolution. A win is preventing a terrorist attack and saving American lives. And part of that was breaking down a wall that had existed between law enforcement on the one hand and intelligence on the other. And because of that wall and the failure to adequately share information, that was one of the causes of the September 11th attacks. So we've been tackling the terrorism problem with this all-tools approach, with intel and law enforcement working side by side. Similarly, when it came to combating the threat of weapons of mass destruction and keeping rogue technologies out of the hands of rogue states and terrorist groups, we used the same all-tools approach with FBI, the intelligence agencies, prosecutors, Treasury Department working together, looking at the threat and doing everything we can to increase the costs and make it more difficult for those who would do harm to achieve their goals. What we were not doing well enough, I realized when I was over at FBI, is as the FBI got really, really good at, along with the intelligence community, at seeing the scope of the threat we were facing on cyber, we watched, and we would literally watch on a screen day after day, hundreds of attacks across the United States, billions of dollars worth of information being exfiltrated. So we got really good at seeing it, but what we weren't doing was disrupting it. And we weren't applying the same approach that we had applied with terrorism and with the proliferation threat. So over the last couple of years, in conjunction with the criminal division, we created a new approach to national security cyber threats that said, let's take that same method of bringing down the wall. Let's make sure that there are prosecutors trained in all 94 U.S. attorneys' offices on how to handle the national security threat on the one hand, which means understanding how to use classified sources and methods, understanding that your role is not necessarily to bring a criminal case, but your role is to make sure that that option's available for when we want to use it. At the same time, to make sure those prosecutors were trained on the bits and the bytes and the peculiarities of cyber law, so the Electronic Communications Privacy Act and the Computer Fraud and Abuse. Once trained, and I see the former deputy director of the FBI out there, Sean Joyce, who was at FBI at the time, Sean and the FBI issued an edict to the field that said to the FBI field offices, thou shalt share what was formerly on the intel side of the house with these specially trained prosecutors, the same way you do in terrorism cases. And it was that change in approach, one, to make sure there was no wall and we were sharing information, two, to focus on developing criminal options when you could, and three, to make sure that we focused on deterrence, on showing that it is not cost-free to steal from American companies day in and day out that led to the PLA case.
So the PLA case was a bit of a sea change. You decided that you were going to, instead of just investigate and decide, finding attribution for a series of cyber attacks, you were going to name, and in this case, actually indict individuals inside a foreign government, the Chinese military. This followed up, obviously, in the last few months with the decision to name and shame North Korea for the Sony hack. Tell us about the decision to go that route instead of just, these are people who are hard to reach. So, changing the way the government approaches these types of cases.
So, as anyone, I was out, the privilege of being out last week at the cybersecurity conference, the RSA conference, and anyone in that field will tell you that defense is not going to do it alone. A private company that has internet-connected computers cannot keep a dedicated nation state out of their systems. So, in addition to improving our defenses, we need to do what we've done with every other threat, which is increase the costs to those who would cause us harm. And that means looking across the range of tools that we have, and it may be criminal prosecution, and it may be sanctions, and doing everything we can to increase the cost to the bad guy so they know that there's going to be a consequence if they commit acts inside the United States. So with the PLA case, you saw the use of a criminal indictment. And there's really, there's three parts of this. One, we have to get good and be able to do the investigation and attribution to figure out who did it. Second, when we do figure out who did it, if it turns out that at the end of the line it's not a criminal group, but it's a nation state, we can't be afraid to say it. We have to say who did it. And three, after we say who did it, there have to be consequences. And that consequence may be a criminal case. In the case of North Korea and Sony, you saw the approach where we very quickly figured out that it was the North Koreans. You had the unprecedented step of saying it publicly. And third, there were sanctions imposed under an existing executive order for North Korea. What you've seen more recently is the president on April 1st announced an executive order for cyber crime writ large, which says, based on your nefarious cyber activities, when you deliberately cause great destructive harm or theft, that you can be sanctioned for those activities. So he added another tool to our toolkit, which I think is an exciting development.
That seemed to elevate this to the point where the way we've treated people who are shipping arms, for example, to terrorists, or were supplying things, weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it's pretty much elevating it to that level if you're going to do sanctions like that. Am I right?
Absolutely. So in my shop, top threats are the terrorists and spies, and how they're committing their craft now. If the spies are already stealing via cyber-enabled means, we need to apply the same approach that we've applied to terrorists and to proliferators to what the Director of National Intelligence has called the top national security threat that the country is facing. And you've seen not one but two FBI directors now, Director Mueller on his way out and Director Comey, say that the thing that they are most focused on are the cyber threats of the future. And in putting out this new executive order on sanctions, the president talked about it being a national emergency. So I think each of us feels an urgency day in and day out where we see the vulnerabilities. In my space, we see the terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda publicly announce, just like they did on the use of airlines, that they want to use cyber-enabled means to cause the most massive attack that they possibly can. Zawahiri said it in 2012.
Right.
And what we need now, it's a bit of a race against time. We need to improve our defenses, and we need to do more each day to disrupt their ability to do the massive attack that they've said they want to do.
Leslie, one of the things that often comes up in these types of investigations is the difficulty of the fact that all these are international in scope. You have victims in Mexico and Brazil and London and the United States, and then you have criminals who might be operating anywhere in Latin America or in Eastern Europe. Tell us about what problem that particular aspect poses for your investigations, for your people that are working on these types of cases.
So I think that's probably the single biggest problem that you identified it in doing a criminal investigation in the cyberspace, is that I haven't seen one yet where there wasn't some international component. The person who's doing the hack or directing a data breach or running a botnet might be sitting in Russia or some other country using servers in yet another country, having money flow through banks in multiple countries, and then cashing them, taking the proceeds in yet another country. So that means that we have to get evidence in all those countries, which is a big challenge. And we've really worked hard. Our Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section and our Office of International Affairs have really worked hard to develop good working relationships with countries all over the world, and not just the countries you might think of, like Western European countries, but also countries in Asia, Latin America, et cetera. That's a huge challenge because there are a lot of international barriers to data sharing. Sometimes we have to go through treaty requests, which can be very time-consuming. And when you're talking about evidence, it's only going to be available for 30 minutes. A treaty request is not really going to be a particularly helpful answer. So we've developed a lot of informal relationships. We're parties to a number of international cooperative organizations where we really have 24/7 links to law enforcement all over the world. But that is a huge challenge, and the criminals know it. The criminals take advantage of the differences in international law. They take advantage of the fact that they know that they can't be extradited from country X if they're a citizen of country X. and they know that in certain countries, data privacy laws will prevent us from getting their data, and they take advantage of those laws. So that is a huge challenge that we really need to work to try to stay ahead of, and we spend a lot of our time dealing with the international aspect of cyber.
Your department, along with the State Department, I believe, offered a $3 million reward for Yevgeny Bogachev, who's the administrator of Game Over Zeus. It seems like you're never going to get him. Just based on the fact that where he is, I guess he's sitting in Russia somewhere. What use is it to do that type of to indict him and to offer this kind of reward if there's not much incentive, I guess, for the Russians to turn over their citizens?
So I think that I wouldn't assume the premise of your question, which is that we're never going to get him, because we have gotten, in the last year alone, we've gotten more than a dozen folks from countries that you wouldn't citizens of countries that you wouldn't necessarily expect, like Russia, Iran, some other Eastern European countries, have been extradited to the United States. A lot of times people travel to a third country where there is an extradition treaty, and there may be a provisional, and there may be a red notice, which is an international alert that somebody is subject to arrest in the United States, and that person can be detained and then extradited. We just extradited a Russian citizen from the Netherlands who was traveling to the Netherlands. So people do travel. I also think that indicting somebody, we generally indict, especially if we think somebody does travel, we generally indict them under seal so that they won't know they're indicted, so that they'll still feel free to travel, and we'll be able to catch them where they go. But sometimes I think in the case of Bogachev, for example, it made sense to indict him publicly for some of the reasons that John said. I also think it makes it harder for other people to work with him. There's a stigma attached to him now that there wasn't before. I think the idea behind the reward was obviously to motivate people to tell law enforcement about where he is and to help us capture him, but I also think that it also sent a bigger message, which was to let cyber hackers generally know that we take this really seriously, and that if they engage in the kind of massive attack like Game Over Zeus, that we're going to mount a very strong campaign to get those people prosecuted into the United States.
So I've been covering, speaking of Russia, I've been covering a story about a very serious breach, what I'm told is one of the most serious breaches we've had in the US government. Hackers who are believed to be tied to the Russian government, who went through the State Department, eventually got into the Executive Office of the President. I know that there's a lot of stuff that you can't talk about, but if you can maybe talk a little bit about the relationship with a government like Russia, where you have, obviously there are things that that the United States and the Russian government agree on international standards of behavior and so on, and then there's obviously activities that are going on behind the scenes. How does that work, that relationship where you can share certain things about perhaps common problems in cybersecurity, but at the same time, you have espionage activities, basically?
Yeah, so it's a good subject to address at a conference dedicated to the international approach that you need to tackle the cyber problem. I think it's really important in this space, and State Department is working on it, and you've heard from them today, but to establish norms. And one thing we need to make sure that we do is don't establish a norm by mistake. For too long, we were not prosecuting criminally theft. And what would happen would be you would figure out an American company had been breached, you do your investigation, and instead of leading to a hacker here in the US or an organized criminal group over in Eastern Europe, it would lead to a nation state. And I was doing these cases as a prosecutor, and what would happen would be there was a locked door, and on the other side of the door was the intel squad, and that's where they were working, that's where it went when it was a nation state. And Lord knows there was enough work on the criminal side of the house, so it's not as if I was banging on that door to get in. But that created a problem. So for a period of time, I think we started accepting the fact that you could target American companies, steal their information, and use it against them in business. And this isn't just happening in the United States. This is happening to our partner countries around the world. It is very important, I think, to say, no, that's not an acceptable norm. You don't get a free pass from jail. We're going to criminally pursue those cases. We're now going to have the ability to sanction them when appropriate. But bottom line is, as a country, we're going to keep increasing the costs until you get the message that this is not acceptable behavior, that this is theft. And similarly, you saw with Sony, when there's a coercive or destructive attack, we, as a government, thought it was incredibly important right out of the box with the first significant destructive attack of that scale aimed at a company inside the United States. You had seen destructive attacks against a Saudi oil company, Aramco, before, and some others. But to make clear that we're treating this as a national security issue. This is not harmless when you try to coerce someone with this type of attack and cause harm, and there are going to be consequences. So I put the destructive attacks and the theft in a category that demands a response.
What did you see change, perhaps? I don't know if change is the right word, but what did you see different from companies, the response from companies after they saw what happened to Sony? You have thousands of computers destroyed, right? Destroyed. You have information, private information being leaked out on public forums. What did you see different from companies as a result of that, if anything?
I'll tell you, Evan, I think there's been not just the Sony event by itself, but last year was the year of the hack in many respects. And you saw Target and Home Depot on the criminal side. You saw the indictment of the PLA case and the Sony case on the national security side. And I just got back from California, and part of the trip I went to LA and met with the general counsels from the entertainment industry. When I was meeting with them earlier in the fall, I met with the Fortune 100 general counsels. And I think for a lot of sectors, they thought, this is never a national security incident, this is never going to happen to me. You know, if you were in finance or defense, you thought of it as a threat that you might have to face. But if you were in an industry like entertainment, the last thing you were thinking is that you're going to be in the midst of a national security incident with the North Koreans. Post-Sony, I got a flood of calls and emails from people who hadn't been that interested before, now asking, hey, what is it that you said again about what we're supposed to do if there's a national security hack? And it's sure on the mind of the entertainment industry. So I hope, in that sense, it was the canary in the coal mine, and before we see a truly devastating attack across a sector, that this will inspire people to take this threat very seriously.
Leslie, would you mind, because your part of this is also responding to very serious hacks on Target, and those seem to be more economically based as opposed to the Sony hack. What did you see change as a result of the Home Depot and the Target?
So I think one thing that's changed pretty dramatically in the last couple of years has been companies no longer feel so much of a stigma if they're hacked, because everyone's getting hacked. And I think that companies are more willing to come forward to law enforcement, are more willing to engage with law enforcement before they're hacked, or at least before they know they've been hacked. And that's been a pretty dramatic change. Even in the time I've been in the job, we've seen companies go from not wanting to have to deal with law enforcement, wanting to take care of the problem on their own, to coming forward as soon as they have an inkling that something has gone wrong and that they've been hacked. So, and I think that's really important, because what an individual company can hire a security consulting firm to do an investigation, but what that security consulting firm doesn't know is what other hacks are happening that have the same markers and are being led by the same groups. And the government has that information. And
so how do you do that? How do you get that conversation going? Like, if I come in and I say my corporation of 5,000 employees has had this very serious breach, I don't know whether anybody else has had the similar thing. Do you provide information? Is there a way for you to provide information to me, or is it for me to talk to my competitors? Which sometimes raises legal liability questions. Well, how do you facilitate that?
So I think that what we've been telling people, and what we're going to tell people at our cybersecurity meeting on Wednesday, is that you need to have a plan. You need to have a point of contact in law enforcement before you're hacked. You need to know what you're supposed to do once you're hacked. Of course, you have to know what kind of preventive measures you should have in place to minimize the chance of a hack. But as John said, even if it's not a state actor, even if it's just a sophisticated, economically motivated criminal, these people are extremely sophisticated, and there's only so much you can do to protect yourself, which is why you need to have a plan of what you should do when something bad happens. And you should definitely have a relationship. The FBI and Secret Service have agents all over the country who have a lot of expertise in this area and want to engage with companies, and you really should do that. And the answer of whether we'll provide information back to you Unfortunately, we're limited in what we can provide back to you because a lot of what we have is either grand jury material or otherwise confidential law enforcement material. So we won't necessarily be able to tell you, oh yeah, Home Depot, the same hackers, I'm making this up, don't quote me on this, the same hackers hacked Target. We won't be able to tell you that, but we'll know that, and that'll help us get these people and bring them to justice, because as John mentioned, there are a lot of different people out there trying to get into our systems. There's state actors, and there are just people sitting in their basement, and it's quite a scary landscape. I have to say, as the head of the criminal division, it's, for me, the scariest thing that's facing us right now.
So you have companies that feel like they're sitting ducks. They're basically under attack at all times. They can, any number of people are trying to breach them, are trying to steal their information. They're trying to get the credit cards of their customers. The idea has arisen among some companies and some people in the private sector that, hey, you know what we want to do is maybe we want to hit back. You know, if we know where you're storing some of our stolen stuff, maybe we can hire people, hackers, good hackers, who can go steal our stuff back or can disable it so that it's not useful to a hacker. What if I came in the door and I said this was my bright idea, what would you say to me?
We'd probably say that's not such a bright idea. I think that's a very risky strategy. There's no guarantee that you're going to correctly attribute the hack. That's one of the problems that we both face is attribution. It can be very challenging. And you may incur your own legal liability if you try to do something like that without even getting necessarily what you were trying to
I might even
recover.
get arrested, you're saying?
Well, I mean, I can't say one way or the other because it would depend on the facts, but we're certainly not looking to prosecute companies that are trying to defend themselves, but I think that there are other kinds of legal liability that you might incur, and it's just a very risky strategy. And it also, frankly, would make it less likely for law enforcement to be able to solve what may be part of a bigger puzzle.
I see. The way, one of the problems that you face is also beyond the economic hacks. You also have a problem with child exploitation. I'm wondering, what, in the order of your priorities, how big of a case does it have to be before I get your attention or your attention to my problem? If I'm a small, tiny little, small business, which is a lot of the victims out there, I think, of this cybersecurity problems, they tend to be small companies. I'm wondering, how big does it have to be before I can get your attention?
So I think it's, most of our cases in the criminal division involve very significant cases, like, for example, Game Over Zeus. There was a botnet was basically infected, I think, about 1 million computers and stole $100 million in a pretty short period of time. And as you said, Evan, many of those victims were mom and pop businesses who didn't have adequate cybersecurity. They had no idea that their bank accounts had been emptied until much after it happened. And so we're interested in large cases that have either a national or an international scope. In the child exploitation space, almost every case that's involving child exploitation now involves the internet. And a lot of it involves the Tor hidden services network. And I don't remember the exact statistic, but somebody told me that some very significant percentage of the activity on the Tor hidden services network involves child exploitation, like well more than 50%. And that's a very significant problem. That's also a very international problem. Our goal is to try to find the people who are producing the child exploitation materials, who are actually abusing the children and selling the materials, and those tend to be international targets. So we try to, with our limited resources, we try to have as big of an impact as we can, so we try to focus on big cases. The U.S. Attorney's offices are able to focus on somewhat more local cases in their districts.
John, do you see small companies? A lot of the big innovation that happens in our economy starts at small startups. And that stuff is extremely valuable sometimes to companies in China and Russia and even some friendly countries. So how important does it have to be before I can get your attention?
I'm glad you asked that question. So from our perspective, we're looking at the threat actor. So it has our attention if it's a nation-state actor targeting that information for either theft or as a spy. And we're certainly interested if it's a terrorist group, no matter how small the company is. And there's been a change when we're going out and talking to the largest companies. I think it is on the radar, and we're starting to penetrate the C-suite, the CEO and the general counsel of what are often multinational corporations that have to do business internationally, and so are dealing with a complicated set of laws that may each handle these incidents somewhat differently. Because of last year and the dedicated outreach, whereas a year or two ago it wasn't on their mind, it was something that was handled just by the tech folks in the company, now it's starting to cross over to the C-suite and the boardroom. But those are the largest companies. I mean, literally the Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 that are turning to this threat and giving it the attention that it deserves. When it comes to the mid-sized or small-sized companies, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done so that it's on their radar. And look, at the end, these are risk decisions that the company is making. It costs money to protect yourself, and you have to balance that against the risk. But that means that you, as the head of a company, are thinking through where you want to draw that line. But one place where I think every company should have the same approach, which is to reach out before you are the victim of a significant attack, have a contact that you trust in law enforcement or at a U.S. attorney's offices, because what you cannot do is, after the attack occurs, try to figure out what your response plan is going to be. It moves too quickly. By the time you figure it out, it'll be too late for us to help you in the way that we ought to help you, particularly whether it's a criminal or a terrorist or a nation state. Your government should be protecting. It's our responsibility to protect you from those threats, but we can't do it if we don't hear from you and we don't work in partnership with you.
One of the concerns that you hear in this area is the issue of privacy, and it's certainly post Edward Snowden the thing that people bring up when they're talking about involving the government in their cybersecurity issues. What do you say to people who say, I mean, look, both of you are now in the business of trying to help the government and companies prevent cybersecurity attacks. How do you balance that with the real concern that people have about privacy and about being able to protect what's theirs?
I guess a couple of things, and they're serious concerns where we need to reach the right policy balance. But one, if you're a consumer and you're using internet-connected computers to do business or personally, what you should worry about, number one on your mind in terms of risk to your privacy, are crooks and nation-state spies and terrorists. It's crooks, spies, and terrorists who are stealing your information day in, day out, publishing it, using it for financial gain. And we have to close that gap to protect your information and protect your privacy.
Certainly a lot of people on this campus, young people, if they were to make a list, a lot of them would also add the NSA, the US government in there. Is that misplaced? Is that a misplaced suspicion and fear, perhaps?
I think so. And so that's partly what we need to correct. Top threat to you right now in the way that you're using your information and having it used in a way that's harmful to your privacy is, again, it's going to be a crook, a spy, a terrorist. They're out there every day stealing people's information and using it maliciously. Secondly, when it comes to sharing information in this space, cybersecurity threat indicator information, and we're looking to see some legislation, this is the type of basic hygiene information that companies should be sharing with each other and government and with the government. And we in the government should do everything we can to strip the identifiers, but provide that essential hygiene information. And so what am I talking about with threat indicator? I'm talking about looking at the bits and the bytes and determining the signature of malware on systems, determining this is not content, this is not speech, this is the tool that bad guys are using day in and day out to cause harm. And so what we need to get better at is sharing it, not just with government and private sector, but making sure that the private sector is sharing it with each other.
Leslie, would you?
Yeah, I think from the criminal side, we always bristle when we hear Edward Snowden's name because that doesn't have anything to do with what we do. We are actually on the criminal side protecting people's privacy from things like spyware, malware, emptying your bank account, stealing your identifying information from your insurance company. We are doing all those things pursuant to court orders. We have the court looking at our search warrants, the court looking at our other warrants, and we are under supervision by the court. Everything we do is very transparent. And so we really view our role really as protecting people's privacy, not invading it.
And looking at the way you respond to, you mentioned, I think we both have mentioned the Saudi Aramco hack, certainly Sony. There's a lot of companies out there that think, well, do I want to spend? I'm barely making any money. My margins are this thin. Why would I want to spend money on cybersecurity? I'm not in critical infrastructure. Why should I think that I'm a target?
So I think that if you are a company that has other people's identifying information, a credit card company, even a small business like a mom and pop tax preparation firm that has people's social security numbers, you really need to view yourself as having an obligation to protect that information you've been entrusted with. So I think you do have to spend money on cybersecurity. Obviously, as John said, you have to weigh the risk to your particular business. But I think it's really foolish to think that you're just willing to take those chances because everyone is vulnerable. And I think that it's really critical that if you're in a kind of business where you're a guardian of other people's privacy information and you're not spending any money on cybersecurity, A, it's really irresponsible, and B, you could find yourself in really big trouble should there be a hack on your system and those people are not going to be happy with you.
John, you mentioned terrorist groups. We've seen in recent months people who claim to be associated with ISIS or with some other terrorist groups doing defacement of websites. People look at that and think, well, it's like kind of like tagging a building. It's like graffiti, right? Do you see, how do you see that problem? And also, do you see it maybe getting worse than that, where they will get some real expertise, perhaps get some real abilities to be able to carry out perhaps an attack on the grid or something like that?
Unfortunately, I do see it getting worse. And that's why there's such an urgency, I think, on what we're doing in this space. Look, about 25 years ago, 98% of what we stored that we cared about, we stored in an analog fashion. And in 25 years, you've seen this amazing flip where now 98% of what we store digitally. It's where our children play. It's, if you're a reporter, it's where you're keeping all the important content that you need to do your job. It's where business keep their intellectual property secrets. Everything we do and value and care about is being stored digitally. And that's been a tremendous boon to the economy. But it also means that all of the bad guys are moving, whether it's the criminal groups or the terrorist groups, and they're going to look to cause, when it comes to terrorists, the harm where we're valuing, where what we value is stored. The terrorists are going to target digital space because that's what we care about and value. And they've told us that they're going to do it. They've announced publicly their intention. Zawahiri saying, calling on jihadists across the world to cause as much damage in this space. You've seen ISIL and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, echo that call. So they have the intent, and it's just a matter of time before they develop the capability on their own or they rent it from a criminal group. So that means...
Because a lot of that stuff is like off the shelf. I mean, you can get malware off the shelf and use it. Am I right?
Yes. It's, right now, it's easy to get some of the tools that could cause a great degree of harm. And criminal groups could cause a great degree of harm now. They're just motivated by profit instead of by an intent to destroy. And so we need to both improve on the defensive side of the house to block the terrorists from doing what they want to do, but we also need to work with our international partners overseas to deprive the terrorists of the ability to acquire that capability.
Yes, and one thing we've seen on the criminal side is an increasing number of individuals who either sell or rent out their botnets so that other people, and they generally don't care what these other people plan to do with them. They just sell them to them, and they do what they want. So that's a very dangerous potential intersection.
That makes it. I mean, so you're saying I mean, this is beyond theoretical. I mean,
Yes.
it's there. It's
there.
there at the ready. Well, listen, I appreciate the conversation, that the time that you've had for this conversation. I want to say thank you to Georgetown and to everybody who has come together here for this conversation. I don't know whether we have the next event in this hall. Okay, so we'll take a break for a few minutes and we'll be back. Thank you.